Excellent. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for this session of our Kennedy Human Rights Book Club. I'm Michael Schreiber, the Chief Operating Officer here at Kennedy Human Rights Center, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this very important conversation we're going to have today. Our book club itself is designed to facilitate timely conversations around our programmatic work. And for this session, we're honored to highlight one of our 2026 Book Award winner, Marie Gottschalk, the author of Crime and No Punishment. This conversation will be moderated by one of our Book Award judges, as well as a Harvard Law School professor, Randall Kennedy. Randall Kennedy is the Michael Klein Professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He was born in Columbia, South Carolina, and attended St. Albans, Princeton University, Oxford University, and Yale Law School. I imagine people have heard of at least some of those. He has served as a law clerk for Judge Skelly Wright of the United States Court of Appeals and for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. He is a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia and Supreme Court of the United States. And importantly, he was awarded the 1998 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for his book, Race, Crime, and the Law. Mr. Kennedy writes a wide range of scholarly and general interest publications. Some of his other books include For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action in the Law in 2013, The Persistence of the Color Line, Racial Politics in the Obama Presidency in 2011, Sellout, The Politics of Racial Betrayal in 2008, Interracial Intimacy, Sex, Marriage, Identity, and Adoption in 2003, and Nigger, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word in 2002. He is a member of the American Law Institute, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Association. Randall, I hope I didn't take up too much of your time doing the introduction, but there's so much that you've lent to us in the work that we are engaged in. We are really looking forward to hearing this conversation, which I believe is our very first between two RFK Book Award winners. With that, thank you very much and welcome, Randall.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be part of this session. We have as our star, our main attraction, Marie Gottschalk of the University of Pennsylvania. I want to congratulate her on her book, Crime and No Punishment, that has recently been awarded the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. She's written several books and she's received many other awards. So, I mean, one of her books was Caught, the Prison State and the Lockdown of American Politics, which received, among other prizes, the Michael Harrington Book Award. She wrote The Prison and the Gallows, The Politics of Mass Incarceration in America, which won the Ellis W. Hawley Book Prize. So Professor Gottschalk has written many articles, several very distinguished books, and I'm delighted to be able to engage in conversation with her. So let me just say welcome, and why don't you kick us off by giving us a few words about your project.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you for being on the award committee and awarding me this book and to the Kennedy Center as well. It's a big book. It's a long book. I think in the final analysis, it's about power, and it's about the concentration of power, and it's about asking us to rethink the relationship between power and violence. And when we think about violence, we often think about homicide, rape, assault. We don't think about the wider harms caused by structural and economic violence, and those actually in actual harms and people hurt are much greater than that. And so this is a big book that interrogates that, and in some ways is a reckoning with some of my earlier work and the shortcomings of my work on mass incarceration.
Well, you're absolutely right. It is very ambitious book, a very powerful book. And to dig into it, I'd like to ask you about a couple of the terms, key terms that you use, um, and ask you to discuss them a little bit. So, for instance, um, you use the term criminal legal system. So I think that, I think there'd be many readers that would be a sort of an unusual um, phrase. Why do you use the phrase criminal legal system?
Words matter.
Mhm.
And words that seem odd become commonplace, right? We think of Ms. as a very odd word decades ago. Now it's commonplace to use that. In my earlier work, I eschewed using terms like murderer, killer, rapist, because a person shouldn't be known by the one worst thing that they've ever done. But I think in my earlier work, I succumbed to saying criminal justice system, where in fact we don't necessarily deliver justice through our criminal justice system. And so I use criminal legal system, and I hope that that captures it more. Just like I started using the word carceral state in my previous book, I wanted to use that in the title, and my editor felt, oh, that's a strange term. And yet it's now become very common to talk about the idea of a carceral state, that it's not how many people are in prison or jail or probation or parole, but it's a wider system and that impinges on our fundamental political institutions, our concepts of democracy, our voting system, and carceral state, recognizing that it's not just about the people who are locked up, but how the whole system is affected by having so many people locked up and under surveillance. And so carceral state works better, and now it too has become a commonplace word.
Yeah, another one is mass incarceration. I think that people are used to hearing it, but what do you mean by mass incarceration?
Yeah, so mass incarceration, when I started teaching about this, I taught a course on mass incarceration, first time maybe in 2005. Like people didn't know what it was. They didn't take my course, right? And thanks to Michelle Alexander now, it's become a commonplace term. And I think we still think of mass incarceration again as the people locked up under surveillance. So the 2 million people sitting in prison and jail at the very moment we're talking, and the several million more who are under probation or parole. I think that carceral state captures the wider implications of having so many of those people under control by the system, paying for having so many people under control and surveillance.
Okay. In this book, again, just pushing a bit more with your lexicon, you
Yeah,
use you use it social murder,
yeah.
which is a quite striking formulation. But when you talk about social murder, what are you
Mhm.
getting at there?
Yeah, I wish I could claim I invented the term, but it's from the 19th century. It's from Friedrich Engels, and I hope that I'm rehabilitating the term and really getting at structural and economic violence. These are avoidable harms, premature deaths that are consequence of structures in the society, economic structures, political structures in the society. And social murder is different than everyday homicide in that we often don't see the perpetrator, right? We don't see these structures. We don't blame anybody. Oh, this many people died of poverty, but there's nobody that we blame. And yet people are dying and dying at larger numbers, largely, arguably, than from homicide, right? So using that term murder and social murder takes it back to what is society doing to kill its people? What are we doing to kill its people? And one of the driving themes of the book is what does it say about a society that's lagging in life expectancy, declining life expectancy, where countries we think of as our peer countries continue to make gains. And the United States used to lead in life expectancy, and now it's actually had these dramatic declines in life expectancy.
Mhm. You know, the title of your book, the title of your very ambitious book, Crime and No Punishment. I mean, one of the things in your book that you focus on a lot is the problem of um, the what you call the criminals in the suites,
Mhm.
uh, the people who are the heads of big companies, corporations, um, um, politicians,
Mhm.
big shots.
Right.
And one big part of your book is to focus our attention on the problem, as you see it, of impunity.
Mhm.
Um, Throughout the book, you really focus on this problem of impunity. You say that, we have people who, in fact, early on, very early in the book, you, you quote Mother Jones.
Mhm.
Page 3 of your book, you quote Mother Jones. I asked a man in prison once how he happened to be there, and he said he had stolen a pair of shoes. I told him if he had stolen a railroad, he would be a United States senator. So a very big part, a very important part of your book is this issue of, who do we even call a criminal? And for people who are doing what you view as hurtful things, what mechanisms of accountability do we have? Now, I want to press you on this a bit. What should be done? So,
Mhm.
for instance, the people who you talk a good bit about the opioid crisis,
Mhm.
and there were a whole bunch of people who were instrumental in the opioid crisis. Question I have, what do you want, what should society do with, you know, the people who have either done things or omitted doing things that have caused tremendous harm? You say that, these are people who have avoided serious criminal penalties, they've avoided serious legal consequences. What sort of penalties, what sort of consequences should befall these people?
Okay, so let me back up on your question and do what my students do, which is answer the question I want to answer, but I hope I'll get around to answering your
Please
question.
do.
So I don't want people to come away from this book, right, and think, well, the rich have always had power, have always been powerful. They've always been corrupt. They've always been criminal, right? We can go back to the founding. George Washington was arguably the richest person in the country at that time. And we could say, I mean, based on some of the work of one of your colleagues, Michael Klarman, that in fact that was an elite coup to maintain that power. What the book tries to do, particularly focusing on the last 60 to 70 years, is to show that power waxes and wanes. And as we have had mass incarceration increasing over the last 50 years, we've had this radical decriminalization within the corporate sector. So the limits that we've had in terms of investigating in prosecutorial powers, investigating in regulatory powers, spending the money, having the uh, trained people, not having such a revolving door between elite law firms and the Department of Justice, that's diminished. So what do you do about that? What I don't want people to come, and this goes to your question, I don't want people to come away from this and say, okay, let's just throw some big CEOs in jail, right? Let's have some big show trials. Because what the book is trying to do is to show that there are deeper structural reasons that the opioid crisis happened. It happened because of things that are going on with FDA. It happened because of deregulation. It happened because of changes in the healthcare system. It happened in part because of the US forever wars overseas. I don't think people should get away without any penalties, but I don't believe that throwing a few CEOs in prison and subjecting them to, like Bernie Madoff, lifetimes of sentences is going to fundamentally change things. That said, as you know, you teach in a law school, law represents how society feels about something. It
Mhm.
represents a certain morality about society, as Durkheim says. If people get off completely scot-free, then it erodes the institutions within society. And you see that with watching what the president is doing today, many people around him being unaccountable. I think people should be accountable, but it doesn't necessarily mean putting them forever in torturous conditions in prison. It may mean having them pay serious fines and penalties and going to court and throwing them out of their Learjet-sized lifestyles and maybe making them back to what the average American has to live on. I'm fine with all that stuff, but I don't want to say incarceration is a solution to the social murder that we're experiencing.
Okay, I'd like to hear you say a bit more about the accountability piece,
Mhm.
because I hear you on your analysis about the structural problems. There is still this issue, though, of personal accountability.
Mhm.
And I can imagine a listener, really wanting to hear and see personal accountability and, again, precisely what does that mean? So, I mean, just now you mentioned, well, you obviously, I mean, you've written very movingly now for a good long while about the torture of prison.
Mhm.
And, fine, we don't want to maybe add to that. On the other hand, how does one show social disapproval of actions that foreseeably hurt people?
So I focus a lot on the economic crisis and that no one seriously was prosecuted for that.
Yes.
And it wasn't from failed prosecutors. There wasn't really an effort to go after and investigate. And what was there was thwarted by the Obama administration. Senator Levin made a number of criminal recommendations to the Department of Justice, criminal referrals. They just died there. An outside committee made criminal referrals. We now know the names of those people. It just died there, right? So I think those should have been investigated. Maybe we should have taken them to trial. Part of the decriminalization of crime and punishment is that we have these non-prosecution agreements. So even when we act, we charge the companies, but we don't charge the individuals. And the interesting thing about non-prosecution agreements is that they're kind of a perversion of something that started in the 19th century to help young people who had gone astray. And it was, if you keep your nose clean, you don't cause any more trouble, we'll not prosecute you. Well, corporations do that now, and yet they don't keep their nose clean. They continued recidivate, and we keep giving them non-prosecution agreements, and we never charge their CEOs. Would I like to see if there were sufficient evidence that these people who were in those criminal referrals brought into court and charged? Yes, I'd like to see that. Would I like to see them serve in torturous conditions in prison? No, because one of the things we know about the history of mass incarceration is we have a tendency to level down. We think we're a liberal state, so we think, okay, if we take the big people at the top and we expose them to bad conditions, we're somehow democratic, right? Where if you look at France or Germany, it was leveling up. Okay, we have better prison conditions for people at the top. Let's try to level up to the people at the bottom. So if you remember from the crack powder cocaine argument, right? People are saying we have these much more severe penalties for crack than we have for powder cocaine. It's disproportionately hurting African Americans. So some people said, okay, let's just increase the penalties for powder cocaine. Well, that's not the point, right? We don't want to level down and give everybody else these bad things. I think also there's a certain shaming if we have to bring major CEOs into courtrooms and make them accountable for what they've done and have them pay sufficient fines and fees as well.
One of the things when I was reading your book, I mean, your book is the winner of the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award.
Mhm.
Thereby, it bears the name of one of the legends of the Democratic Party. Uh, you're rather tough on some of the key figures in the recent history of the Democratic Party. Let me read you from page 394 of your book. Quote, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and their wealthy patrons were deeply culpable in the rise of Trumpism. That's a, that's a important theme of your book. You're extremely critical of the current president and his administration, and I'm going to get to that with some questions in a few minutes. But one of the things that you really push very hard in your book is, let's not just take a look at the current administration. The current administration was inadvertently helped out by Democratic administrations. Could you say more about that?
This is a deeply historical book, and history matters. And I think about a number of years ago, after I graduated from college, I taught in China. It was shortly after the Cultural Revolution. And there had been a decision made by the Chinese Communist Party that the Gang of Four had caused the Cultural Revolution. And my students would hold up 5 fingers because the 5th finger was understood to be Chairman Mao. And so that became kind of acceptable. But I would say, well, history is really about the structure that's holding up the hand, right? And we need to look at what structure and decisions were made by the Clinton and Obama administrations that facilitated the emergence of Trumpism and the current president. And the fact that Barack Obama essentially blinked on any kind of reckoning with the causes of the financial crisis and the culprits of the financial crisis. And he couldn't even push himself to advocate for limits on CEO salaries. And at one point, when it came out that many of these corporations and banks that had gone under and gotten this windfall from the government to stay afloat had given these huge bonuses, the administration didn't do much about it. It did some window dressing, but didn't do much. And one of the key figures in the administration said, at that point, we lost the public. And the public can see what happened. And history is about a reckoning. And I think with the current administration, with Trump, there's so many excesses that anything before him looks good. But there wasn't a golden era. And we need to have that reckoning with the Democratic Party, that reckoning with the economic crisis that I think we really, really haven't had, and what we did wrong, and to own up to that, what was done wrong. And the other thing where politics matter is it's easy to paint the last couple of decades as completely polarized politics. And I think if you look at the debate over the Affordable Care Act, you can make that argument. It was polarized. The Republicans clearly didn't want the Obama administration to have a win. On economic reform, right, when Obama came in, the first 12 months or so, there was a lot of support, even from conservative Republicans, for a more radical economic restructuring. And the Obama administration, particularly Timothy Geithner, Larry Summers, squashed that support that was percolating. And I think that you actually could have come for a more deep economic restructuring, banking restructuring, regulation, going after the culprits. And the administration didn't pursue that. And we can't read back into that. It was polarized politics that stopped us. Because if you look at what I think is a careful history that I show where people were lining up at the time, you could have built those coalitions, but the administration did not want to build those coalitions.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've noticed in this book, that's, I take it a bit different than some of your previous work. You've always been very strong on the race question, focusing a lot of attention on racial injustice in the administration of criminal justice throughout American history. That's been you've come back to that over and over, and that's a very important part of this book as well. I would say, however, I get the impression, however, that in this book, you've sought to recalibrate to some extent. That in this book, you seem to be saying to the reader, or at least I perceive you to be saying to the reader, yes, racism is a problem, it's a threat. We have to always keep our eyes on it. But the class issue is a part of the story that has not gotten enough attention. Let me read you a sentence from your book. Quote, the tendency to focus on racial disparities has overshadowed disparities related to class, ethnicity, geography, gender, sexuality, and so forth. I take it that you are suggesting that people have to have a broader spectrum of problems that they need to be attentive to when they're thinking about the um, the problem of crime and punishment in America. Am I right in that?
I'm trying to identify is race and class interacting? And even what do we mean by race, right? Do we mean individual personal bias or prejudice? And so I have a whole two chapters on policing, right? And the conventional understanding of a lot of about policing is it's the individual bias of police officers that causes disproportionate racial disparities in who's killed by the police. But if we try to do all the racial bias training we want to do, we could possibly do, it's probably not going to move the needle very much on that, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that we have highly militarized police for everybody. They're just more militarized for some people than they are for other people. And it's not just about individual prejudice against people of color, but it's also about how the United States has imported behaviors that it's done overseas and training of police overseas and strategies of police overseas and imported them back into policing back at home. Likewise, when we've had these large-scale wars, whether it's Vietnam or the forever wars, there's been lots of anxiety about what's going to happen to the veterans, right? And so we have special programs to feed veterans into police departments. And we know that veterans tend to have higher rates of shooting, right? The other thing that I'm very driven by in this book is how do we form coalitions, right? How do we form coalitions of the dispossessed in the United States? If we think of militarized policing as primarily a problem of Black people or Black men in cities, we're missing opportunities to form coalitions. That our most spectacular public deaths are often in urban areas because there's media there are phones there are more crowds there, et cetera, to witness. The little data we have is that rural areas may have comparable or even higher rates of killing. We certainly know that for Indigenous people in rural areas. And so the problem of militant policing is across the board. It's more for some people than less people, but a white woman in America is going to have a higher rate of death than a white woman in Germany by many times over, right? Now, is that going to be the front face of against militarized policing in the United States? No, but it's important to understand that the things that happen to the most dispossessed people and African Americans throughout American history migrate to other populations. Likewise with incarceration. Incarceration rates have been going down in urban areas in some ways because of the criminal justice reform coalitions that have become very powerful in certain cities. But the highest rates of increase, and you're more likely to be incarcerated now, are in rural and suburban areas, right? And so if we think of mass incarceration as primarily an urban problem, how are we going to form those coalitions?
Yeah, I'd like to stay on that subject for a moment.
Okay.
So I had a colleague and a friend, Derek Bell,
Mhm,
who
sure.
wrote a piece that's been cited a whole lot, called an interest convergence. And basically his theory was that in America, because of its racism, important reform was unlikely to develop traction unless you could pair the reform with the interests of at least a substantial number of white people. I mean, he said if you don't do that, you're not going to get traction. Now, if that is true, and I think there's a lot to that, unfortunately, I just think that, it's people don't tend to be altruistic. People tend to, do things that they think are going to advance, their interests. If that's true, then if we think about your subject, the administration of criminal justice, mightn't that argue in favor of, for instance, let's suppose you're trying to focus public attention on the problem of police misconduct. You can, have a demonstration and have on your placards the pictures of Black people who have been hurt by the police. Now, you could proceed in that way, and of course, many people have proceeded in that way, and that's been, somewhat effective. On the other hand, I can imagine somebody saying, "Listen, let's keep the Black victims of police misconduct out there, but let's put some white people on those placards. There are plenty of white people who've been beaten up wrongly by the police, who've been shot by the police. Let's do things to let white people know, hey, this isn't just about Black people. There's police misconduct that hurts white people, that hurts everybody." What about that as a strategy, and a strategy of enlarging the tent for people who are concerned about police misfeasance?
So what you call pairing under strategic interests, I would call coalition building.
Okay.
So if we look at what happened in Minneapolis, a lot
Mhm.
of people were out in the street putting their lives at risk. It wasn't for altruistic reasons. A lot of them were not going to get picked up by ICE, except if they got in ICE's face as a demonstration, but they could have gone along with their lives, right? But these were coalitions that were built over time that predated George Floyd. And it's not just that you're pairing interests, but you're actually having people sitting across in neighborhood centers, on street corners, in coffee houses, understanding where they're each coming from, what they're willing to sacrifice, what their bottom line is that they're not willing to sacrifice, and also that it's not all just a cost benefit analysis for politics, right? And if, I go back, I talk a lot about militarism and imperialism in the book. I go back to the early 20th century, the concerns about World War I, and in some ways, World War II and Vietnam as well. But if you go back to early 20th century, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, they were part of anti-racial Jim Crow coalitions, but they were also anti-imperialist coalitions. And they saw that connection between the domestic politics and the international politics. And it wasn't just about Jim Crow and African American people. Likewise, we have a very sanitized view of Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther King in many ways was, especially towards the last few years of life, but even earlier, closer to Malcolm X in making these international domestic connections. They don't fall out simply, is this good for white people? Is this good for Black people or not, right? And if we, as the arguments that Ida B. Wells and Booker T. Washington made in the early 20th century, and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, if we're spending all that money on the military, then we're not taking care of the domestic problems at home. And we're also emboldening certain corporations and militaristic interests. So it's making it's a racial argument, but I think it's a much more complex racial argument than just strategically we should put Black and white people together.
What's what's your assessment looking back now on Black Lives Matter?
Wow, that's a hard question. It's a big question. I would go back to what I said about Minneapolis, right? I mean, I think if you look at just legislatively, that, the very little happened in Congress. The bills that got passed were actually bolstering the police in important ways. We didn't even get something that would limit qualified immunity and some of the core concerns. That said, politics, things don't change overnight. If you study movements, right? Like people say to me, why go to a King's movement? No King's movement, it's not going to change things. Well, if you're going to do that cost benefit analysis all the time, you're never going to go do anything. Likewise, it's the long civil rights movement. It's the long Black Lives Matter movement. And those ingredients go back, as I said earlier, predating George Floyd. And what those mobilizations were happening, educating people about the police. That's why such an effective challenge to ICE could happen at that moment in time. I don't think people would give Black Lives Matter that credit, but it is those coalitions, even if people didn't always identify with Black Lives Matter, they were in that ether that created the possibilities. And I think that mutual aid challenging across the country of ICE has to go back to some learning as well as some actual coalitions that were built, thanks in part to Black Lives Matter.
Mhm, mhm. Um, Prison abolition. Where are you with respect to prison abolition? Do you call yourself, for instance, a prison abolitionist?
Yeah, I think we don't have a good understanding of what abolitionism is, right? And it's either you're for it or you're against it. And then it becomes, oh, you're for it, so let's let all the people out of prison, right? And do you really want Charles Manson on the streets out of prison? And it's the end of the discussion. I think if we have a proper understanding or a more capacious understanding of abolitionism, is that it's, first of all, challenging reforms that may be good in the moment, but help to strengthen the system overall. Abolitionism is also talking about transformation, right? And that what are transformative politics rather than just an idea of let's let people out of prison or not let people out of prison. I think that it has furthered the argument, but in many ways, people ask the very question you ask, are you an abolitionist or not? Are you not an abolitionist? I would say if the book wasn't so long as it was, I was hoping to write a chapter on abolitionism, right? And a more refined understanding of abolitionism. If you can see from the book, I draw from key abolitionists, but do I say I am an abolitionist or I'm not an abolitionist? I'm going to be agnostic. And I think you can see the influence of abolitionists on the final chapter. And I think more influence and more systematic thinking than perhaps in my other books.
Well, that's of course, that's why I asked you the question here.
Right,
Um,
right. Are
but
you an abolitionist?
I want to push you a bit. I want to push you a
Yeah.
bit because, well, I've been very critical
Mhm.
of the marching under the banner of prison abolition. In part, when somebody says, and I'd be really interested in your reaction to this, when somebody says that they are a death penalty abolitionist, okay, that means that they want an end to the death penalty under all circumstances. And I can understand that. If somebody is a slavery abolitionist, they want, they want an end to it. And that's it, an end to it. Okay, I can understand that. With prison, There are some people, you mentioned Charles Manson. I mean, there's a huge country, 300 million people. There's going to be a certain number of people who are going to have done things, who are going to be such a danger to the community that it would be a disservice to the community not to actually have them restrained in some way. Now, why not call your politics transformative politics? I'm in favor of shrinking the prison system radically. I'm down with that.
Mhm.
But when you use the word abolition, it seems to me that you construct a difficulty for yourself that just as a matter of politics doesn't seem wise to me. What do you think?
I think abolitionism is in some ways going back to that very storied history, right, of slavery abolition, death penalty abolition, and some real wins with that. I think if we actually look at the history of slavery abolition, there were people who were for abolishing slavery, but they were also for sending the enslaved people to Africa or Central America or someplace else, but we're
Mhm.
calling them abolitionists, right? So there were a lot of Big Ten people under abolished slavery as well, right? I think that we need to say the conditions that people serve time in prisons in the United States, prisons as they are torturous and inhumane. So we can want Charles Manson to be restrained, but it doesn't mean that we restrain him in a cage, in a torturous cage that defines many prisons in the United States. And you
Mhm.
could say we want to abolish those torturous cages. We want far fewer people in those torturous cages. We want to go back to rates of incarceration that the United States has historically had or that are comparable to peer countries. But we don't want the torturous, inhumane conditions that we confine people now, and we don't want the numbers that we have now. And I think that's can be consistent with calling for abolition.
Okay. Okay. We've got a wonderful audience, and our wonderful audience has sent a few questions. Let me turn to a couple of audience questions. First, you wrote a lot about corporate corruption that has gone unprosecuted. Can you touch on your recommendations for making it simpler for courts to prosecute corporate misbehavior?
Well, one of the things is legislation that's been brought up for several years in Congress now. Senator Elizabeth Warren has been a chief advocate of that, is to do away with or limit non-prosecution agreements, make them more transparent, make them reviewable by judges, invest more in the Department of Justice in going after corporate crime, reducing the revolving door between elite corporate law firms and the Justice Department. These are key recommendations that I would have, as well as beefing up the regulatory apparatus and the independence and the regulatory apparatus like the SEC.
Mhm, mhm. One of the things that I really enjoyed about your book was seeing your analysis of the administration of criminal justice with respect to subjects that I'm, really familiar with,
Mhm.
the street
Mhm.
crime
Yeah.
focus, and putting that right next to the crime in the suites, not crime in the streets, but crime in the suites, and showing how dramatically different those things are handled, showing the way in which I think people's intuitions. I know that for me, I find it very difficult, for instance, I'm struggling with this, but the very notion of what we even describe as a crime, I think that, robbery, rape, assault, those, that grabs you by the throat. These other things, which as you show so dramatically in your book, hurt people in in huge ways. I mean, the numbers are staggering, but we have difficulty even thinking of that as a crime. And in fact, there are many layers in our criminal justice system where that's, we might have civil penalties. It might be the realm of tort, but actually thinking of those things as criminal, I think that it's going to take a lot of struggle to get people's mind around that and thinking of those sorts of activities as anything even coming close to criminal. I think that's going to be a very difficult task, and I salute you for helping with that task. But that's going to be very difficult, I think, to sort of develop the intellectual groundwork to make those sorts of reforms even possible.
So let me do a grab you by the throat, use your phrase, right? At the height of the opioid crisis, which continues today, total number of deaths was 108,000 people, right? Like, what does that number mean? The whole 10 years of the Vietnam War, about 55,000 Americans were killed. And that doesn't include the millions of other people in Southeast Asia who died from the US war in Vietnam. So in 1 year, we as a country tolerated that because of our policies about opioids and drugs. That if we had the same rate of opioid deaths as in Portugal, we would be talking about hundreds of deaths a year rather than 108,000 deaths. And that to me is a social murder. And that to me is a silence about a huge number of deaths that we are tolerating, and locking up a few Sacklers or pointing to the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma is so, even if you could do it and it hasn't been done, is so incidental to what the problem is. And in fact, a lot of this book is driven by thinking about those deaths of the opioid crisis, is where it goes back to race too, because if we say, people argue we've gone lighter on the war on drugs because it affected white people and not African American people as much, the opioid crisis. In fact, we've been throwing the book at white people about the opioid crisis, and when we're not throwing the book at them, we're letting them die. And now that we're in a phase of the opioid crisis where it's moving to cities because of fentanyl, now the overdose rates for African American people the last few years are surpassing white people. But prior to that, it was white people. But if we characterize that as largely a white people's crisis that we've gone light on, now that it's moving into with African American people and with higher rates of death, then people can say, "Oh, we solved that problem, right? We don't have that problem." When in fact it's moved into expanded to other populations. So I actually think that is, to use your words, a really grab you by the throat. What does it say about crime? What does it say about social murder that we tolerate? Over the last 10, 15 years, 1 million deaths from opioid overdoses that are not happening in other countries.
Is it a problem that you're going to confront, that when we think about crime, when we think about crime in any, or certainly the great most crime, especially if we're talking about murder, social murder, let's just take that phrase, murder, isn't intent such an integral, central, powerful part of the administration of criminal justice, to the extent that intent is so important? Isn't that going to militate sort of against what you're after? Because these people, the first thing they're going to say, and what they do say, and it's probably sincere, it's probably true. Hey, I didn't intend to kill anybody. I was just out to make a buck. and making a buck is a good old, that's, what's more American than trying to make a buck. That people were killed was collateral. It was incidental. It certainly wasn't what I intended.
But we don't say
Now,
that to people who are dealing drugs in West Philadelphia who go out to make a drug deal and somebody dies. We even lock up people for life sentences because they loaned a car to somebody and we call them an accomplice and they should be charged with third degree or second degree murder in those cases, right? So what's an accomplice? Who's responsible? I mean, we know these drug companies knew there were these high levels of overdose deaths. We also had health officials who knew if you suddenly crack down on pill opioids, on OxyContin, people were going to move over to heroin. And you would have overdose deaths, and then the heroin market became infused with fentanyl at that time. And we had opioid producers who were saying, we're going to go after white people because society treats their pain more seriously, and the selling of drugs, if we target African American people, we're not going to get approval for these drugs. So in some ways, it's race, but it's race being used in a different way and in a very calculated way. And they had that data that people were dying and were dying at enormous levels. And we don't make if I go out, if an impoverished person in Philadelphia goes out right now and steals a bunch of stuff from my local supermarket, people don't make the argument this person has to feed their family. We just say that they stole that, right? So why are we saying the drug companies are just trying to make money? If somebody died as collateral damage, not their problem. We do that to poor people, and working class people and other people in the system all the time. It's a common argument.
hmm hmm I hear you. I mean, again, maybe my comment illustrated, you know, if we're talking about certain sorts of conduct, we are more willing to impute baleful, bad
Hmm.
ideas, notions. We're willing to sort of throw the book
Right.
versus other sorts of conduct which we don't like, but emotionally we have a somewhat different, disposition towards it, which makes the imputation of criminal liability a more difficult thing. Maybe that's part of what you're trying to get at with
That's the
your,
heart of the book.
yeah. Okay.
I mean, we take fines and fees. If we put a big fine against a corporation, we worry about the future of the corporation. But we have people serving time in prison and jail now because they can't pay $100 fine or
hmm
$250 fee, right? And we think that's fine, but we worry about corporations being able to pay fines and fees that are minuscule compared to their profits.
I want to be careful. We're down to the wire, but I want to ask you, what's next for you? What are the projects that you have in mind to deepen your exploration of the problems of crime and punishment in America and the relation of crime and punishment in America to the problem of democracy in America? What's down the road for you?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could be like lots of my colleagues who have 4 or 5 book projects that they're working on or thinking on all the whole time. Most of my cases, it's only when I'm almost done writing the book that I know what the book is about. So it's never good for applying for fellowships and grants and whatnot. I teach about the presidency. I've been teaching about the presidency for 25 years now, more than 25 years. And I am thinking about a book on the presidency. And I guess you reached a certain age where everybody's not going to take your courses. What's your legacy? What is my framework for understanding the presidency? But it is very hard to think about the presidency 24/7 all the time. But that's the direction that I think I'm moving. And I'd like to think this current book isn't just about crime and punishment, but it really is a larger window into what's happening in American politics today.
Very much. I mean, the last section of your book, I'll read the title. It's a title that I find deeply disturbing. Twilight for Democracy in America? Question mark.
Mhm.
I mean, the last 3 pages of your book, well, I'll read a little bit more. You talk about the full frontal assault on the electoral apparatus, the media, universities, unions, governing institutions, and civil society. You say that these assaults have delegitimized the electoral process and put democracy in America at great risk. That is a heck of a statement, that what has gone on has put democracy in America at great risk. In the time that we have, and we only have just a minute or two, could you elaborate on that? What do you mean at great risk? How afraid are you? I'm very afraid. How afraid are you?
I'm very afraid. But the fear, right, is sometimes we think democracies disappear because of tanks in the street and coups and things like that.
Mhm.
Democracies often disappear because of erosion and corrosion and very legitimate political institutions that aid and abet the erosion of democracy. And I think that's what we're seeing in the United States. And this book tries to highlight those things made possible the emergence of Trumpism in 2026 and the strengthening of, I'm sorry, in 2016 and the strengthening of Trumpism over the last 10 or 12 years.
Listen, I have thoroughly enjoyed talking with you. I enjoyed reading your book. I got a lot out of it. I wish you all the best, and I would just like to thank the sponsors of this event, the Kennedy Human Rights Center, for sponsoring this event. It's events like this that are going to help us get out of the predicament that we're in. It's very important, and I salute the Kennedy Human Rights Center for sponsoring this. And again, Professor Gottschalk, thank you so much for what you've done. I look forward to your future writings.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for your deep engagement with the book. And you were, as you can see in my final chapter, very pivotal in how I tried to understand coalitions and how we draw people together and issues of race. And your work has been very foundational for me in that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Professor Kennedy and Professor Gottschalk. A great conversation, and I don't think we could end on a better cliffhanger than the threat to the entire democratic system in the United States. So I hope that you will continue to raise flags, and I hope that our organization will continue to fight both legal and advocacy battles that help address, redress, and engage. So that the next book is about a surprise that we hadn't seen and bending the arc of justice and repairing the system. But until that time, thank you both. And for those in the audience, if you are an author and are publishing a book this year and want to learn more about the book award itself, please check our website. And if you're a member of the audience who is new to our book clubs, or if you're a returning viewer, please plan to join us when we'll have Alina Das, who will discuss her book, No Justice in the Shadows, on September 16th at noon. You can register for that on our website. But until next time, please stay in touch with our newsletters, social media, and the work that each of you are doing. And again, thank you on behalf of the Kennedy Human